Step into a fog-shrouded medieval square, the year 1450, where the air is thick with the acrid scent of smoke, sweat, and fear. The cobblestones are slick with morning dew, and a wooden scaffold looms like a grim sentinel, its timbers stained with the memory of blood. A crowd gathers, peasants in tattered cloaks, merchants clutching purses, nobles in fine furs, their eyes fixed on a chained figure, accused of heresy or witchcraft, trembling before the executioner's blade. The crowd's murmurs rise to cheers or fall to silence, their emotions a volatile tide that shapes the spectacle. This is the dark heart of medieval torture, a world where cruelty was not just punishment but a ritual of power, a mirror of society's deepest fears and desires. Why did entire communities flock to witness such horrors? What drove the hands that turned the rack, lit the pyre, or tightened the screws? Today, we're plunging into the social and psychological reasons behind medieval cruelty, exploring the dark psychology that fueled historical cruelty and the haunting mysteries that linger in its shadow. From witch hunts to public executions, these stories unravel the forces fear, faith, power, and collective madness that defined a brutal era. Whether you're driving through the night, working at your desk, or craving a tale that grips your soul, settle in. Let's unravel the dark history of medieval torture, where the human psyche turned pain into a language of control. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 12th to the 16th centuries, were a crucible of chaos and control. Plague swept through villages, claiming millions. Famine starved entire regions, and wars, from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War, left scars on the land and its people. In this world of uncertainty, medieval torture was more than a tool of justice. It was a social and psychological mechanism to impose order, purge sin, and channel collective fear. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, a notorious guide to witch hunting, and chronicles like those of Jean Froissart paint a society gripped by dread of the supernatural, rebellion, and divine wrath. Torture devices, the rack, breaking wheel, strappado, thumbscrew, or burning at the stake, were wielded by the church and state, but their cruelty was driven by deeper forces. Fear of the unknown, the need for scapegoats, the power of crowds, and the dehumanization of the accused. The dark psychology of medieval cruelty thrived in communal rituals, where shared emotions amplified fear, vengeance, or fascination, turning neighbors into accusers and victims into spectacles. This is a journey into the social and psychological roots of historical cruelty, a chilling exploration of medieval torture and the human impulses that fueled its brutality. Let's begin with the social context of medieval cruelty, where fear was the pulse of society. The Black Death, raging from 1347 to 1351, killed up to half of Europe's population, leaving survivors to grapple with loss and the specter of divine punishment. Famines, like the Great Famine of 1315-1317, starved villages, while wars such as the 100 Years' War bred instability and mistrust. In this fractured world, the Church framed misfortune as God's judgment, with texts like the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas urging the purging of sin through pain. Medieval torture, from public executions to dungeon interrogations, became a way to restore order, targeting heretics, witches, or rebels as scapegoats for societal woes. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, 1532, codified torture as a legal tool, authorizing devices like the rack or thumbscrew to extract confessions or deter crime. Communities, bound by shared fear, turned on outsiders, widows, healers, or foreigners, accusing them of witchcraft or treason. This social paranoia, driven by a desperate need to explain suffering, fueled historical cruelty, making medieval torture a communal act, its dark psychology rooted in collective dread. The crowd was a central force in medieval cruelty, their psychology amplifying the spectacle of pain. Picture a bustling square in Nuremberg, 1470, where thousands gather to watch a heretic burned at the stake, the flames casting a glow on their faces, some fervent, others horrified. The Nuremberg Chronicles describe crowds as essential to public punishments, their presence validating the act and spreading its warning through towns and villages. The dark psychology of crowds' fear, anger, or morbid curiosity created a feedback loop, where cheers, jeers, or stunned silence intensified the event's impact. As noted in the Gesta Treverorum, crowds could be unpredictable, sometimes storming scaffolds to rescue those they deemed innocent, turning torture into a flashpoint for rebellion. This volatility made medieval torture a double-edged sword, enforcing control while risking unrest. The crowd's shared emotions, from vengeful shouts to sympathetic tears, were a driving force in historical cruelty, their dark psychology turning torture into a communal ritual that defined the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's dive into the psychological reasons behind medieval cruelty, starting with fear of the supernatural. The Church's teachings, reinforced by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, framed witches and heretics as agents of the devil, threats to both soul and society. This fear drove tortures like the strappado, where victims were hoisted by their arms to confess devilish pacts, or burning at the stake, seen as a purifying act to save the community from divine wrath. The Annals Ecclesiastici note that torturers, often outcasts or low-status men, were driven by a mix of duty and fear, believing their work served God's will. The psychological need to control the unknown disease, storms, or crop failures led communities to scapegoat individuals, their pain a ritual to appease an angry deity. This dark psychology, rooted in superstition and dread, made medieval torture a desperate act to impose order on a chaotic world, its historical cruelty a reflection of humanity's deepest anxieties. Let's explore a story that captures the dark psychology of medieval cruelty. In 1590, in North Berwick, Scotland, a midwife named Agnes Sampson was accused of witchcraft during a frenzied witch hunt spurred by King James VI. The News from Scotland describes her torture with the strappado in a dungeon beneath Edinburgh Castle. Her arms wrenched until they dislocated as interrogators demanded confessions of summoning storms against the king's ships. Despite her agony, she initially resisted, but the pain broke her, and she confessed to devilish pacts. Yet the next morning, the dungeon was empty, the ropes severed, and a crescent moon carved into the stone wall. Did her allies, perhaps fellow midwives, risk death to free her, driven by loyalty or defiance? Or was her body removed by royal order to silence rumors of her innocence? Locals whispered of a ghostly figure haunting the castle, chanting spells under moonlit skies, her voice a defiant echo. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how fear and faith fueled historical cruelty, its dark psychology sparking legends that outlived the scaffold. The need for social control was another driver of medieval cruelty, rooted in the rigid feudal hierarchy. Lords and kings used torture to suppress rebellion, with public spectacles like the breaking will serving as grim warnings to the masses. The Saxonspiegel, a German legal code, notes that torture was a public act, its visibility reinforcing the power of authority. The breaking wheel, used for heinous crimes like murder or treason, shattered bones before crowds, its brutality a message of obedience, as described in the Nuremberg Chronicles. Yet excessive cruelty could backfire during the Bamberg witch hunts of the 1620s, where hundreds were tortured and executed. Communities began to resist, hiding accused witches or questioning the church's methods. This tension, seen in the Pendle witch trials of 1612, where local sympathy saved some from the gallows, reveals how medieval torture aimed to unify society but often sowed division. The dark psychology of control, seeking to enforce order through pain, was a cornerstone of historical cruelty, its legacy a complex tapestry in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's explore another psychological factor: the dehumanization of the victim, a key mechanism in justifying cruelty. The Church's rhetoric, as in the Malleus Maleficarum, framed heretics and witches as less than human agents of Satan who deserved no mercy. This dehumanization allowed torturers to inflict horrors like the witch's chair, studded with spikes to pierce flesh, or water torture, simulating drowning, without guilt. The Directorium Inquisitorum by Nicholas Eimerich notes that torturers were trained to see victims as sinners, their pain a path to divine justice. Communities, too, embraced this mindset, cheering as neighbors were racked or burned, their empathy dulled by fear and faith. Yet some victims resisted this narrative, their defiance like Joan of Arc's steadfast courage during her 1431 execution in rune-inspiring sympathy and turning them into martyrs. This dark psychology, where empathy was suppressed to justify cruelty, made medieval torture a chilling reflection of historical cruelty, its impact echoing through the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's dive into another tale, this one from 1477 in France, during the reign of Louis XI. A noblewoman named Jeanne de Montaigne was accused of poisoning her lord and tortured with water torture in Paris's Place de Grève. Chronicles by Enguerrand de Monstrelet describe her gasping as water filled her lungs. Yet she refused to name accomplices, her silence a quiet rebellion. The next day, her cell was empty, with a single white rose left in the damp, its petals untouched by the dungeon's gloom. Was this a miracle, suggesting her innocence, or a staged rescue by her family, defying the crown's authority? Locals claimed the square was haunted, with the scent of roses wafting at dawn and shadowy figures glimpsed near the dungeon, their faces veiled in mist. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how the dark psychology of scapegoating and fear fueled historical cruelty, its stories woven into the dark history of medieval Europe. The role of religion in medieval cruelty was profound, shaping both its methods and its justification. The Church framed crime as sin, with tortures like burning at the stake seen as divine judgment, purifying the soul or protecting the community from God's wrath. Priests attended executions, chanting prayers or demanding repentance, as seen in Spanish Inquisition records. The Malleus Maleficarum justified torture as a means to save souls, arguing that pain drove out the devil. Yet this zeal sparked debate. Theologians like Johannes Nider, in his Formicarius, questioned excessive cruelty, fearing it alienated the faithful or invited divine retribution. In the Würzburg witch hunts of the 1620s, where hundreds were burned, such excesses led to public unrest, with some communities hiding accused witches. This tension between salvation and sadism made medieval torture a complex ritual, its dark psychology blending faith with fear, a cornerstone of historical cruelty in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's explore another story, this one from 1610 in Logroño, Spain, during the Basque witch trials. A healer named Maria de Arburu was accused of cursing livestock and tortured with the strappado in an Inquisition dungeon. Records describe her screams as her shoulders dislocated. Yet she refused to name accomplices, her silence infuriating her interrogators. The next morning, her cell was empty, with a single candle burning, its flame unextinguished despite the damp. Was this a daring rescue by her village, risking death to save their healer, or a divine sign of her innocence? Locals claimed the dungeon dripped with water, echoing Maria's prayers at night, a haunting reminder of her defiance. This mystery, rooted in medieval torture, highlights the dark psychology of fear-driven accusations, its historical cruelty sparking tales of resistance that linger in the dark history of medieval Europe. The power of crowd psychology was a key driver of medieval cruelty, transforming torture into a communal spectacle. In 1498, in Florence, a merchant named Lorenzo di Banco was accused of usury and tortured with the rack before a fervent crowd in the Piazza della Signoria. The Historia Florentina by Machiavelli notes the crowd's fervor, their shouts drowning Lorenzo's cries as the rack stretched his limbs. But the next morning, the rack was found broken, Lorenzo gone, and a torn cloak left behind, its edges frayed as if by unseen hands. Was this a staged escape by his allies, defying Savonarola's zeal, or a divine omen of his innocence? Locals claimed the square was haunted, with ropes swaying on windless nights and footsteps echoing in the dark. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how crowd psychology amplified historical cruelty, its dark psychology making spectators complicit in the spectacle. A grim thread in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's explore the role of fear in shaping torturers themselves, a lesser-examined aspect of medieval cruelty. Torturers, often outcasts or criminals granted leniency for their work, operated in a liminal space, shunned by society yet essential to its justice. The London Chronicles describe executioners as hooded figures, their anonymity protecting them from vengeance, yet their role required a psychological detachment. Many believed they served God or the state, as seen in Inquisition records, where torturers justified their work as purging sin. Yet the act of inflicting pain, turning the rack's crank, or wielding the breaking wheel's iron bar required suppressing empathy, a process that could haunt even the most hardened. Some torturers, as noted in trial records from Bamberg, showed hesitation, refusing to push victims to death, suggesting cracks in their psychological armor. This dark psychology, where duty and cruelty intertwined, made torturers both perpetrators and victims of historical cruelty, their role a chilling reflection of medieval torture's complexity. Let's dive into another tale, this one from 1560 in Colchester, England, during early witch hunts. A widow named Elizabeth Howe was accused of cursing crops and tortured with thumbscrews in a dungeon, her fingers crushed until she screamed. Court records note her defiance, refusing to name accomplices, but the next morning, the dungeon was empty, with a sprig of lavender left behind, its scent lingering in the damp air. Was this a village rescue, defying the magistrates, or a divine sign of her innocence? Locals claimed the dungeon smelled of lavender, with faint cries echoing at dusk, a haunting reminder of Elizabeth's resilience. This mystery, rooted in medieval torture, shows how the dark psychology of scapegoating fueled historical cruelty. Its story's a poignant thread in the dark history of medieval Europe. The psychological mechanism of projection played a significant role in medieval cruelty, as communities displaced their fears onto the accused. The Malleus Maleficarum encouraged this, framing witches as the cause of crop failures, disease, or storms. By torturing or executing these scapegoats, communities believed they could purge their troubles, as seen in the Trier witch hunts of the 1580s, where hundreds were tortured with devices like the witch's chair or strappado. This projection allowed societies to externalize their anxieties, turning neighbors into enemies. Yet it also sparked resistance. Some communities, as in the Pendle witch trials, hid accused witches, rejecting the church's narrative. This dynamic, where projection drove cruelty but also defiance, reveals the dark psychology of medieval torture. Its historical cruelty, a complex interplay of fear and rebellion in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's explore another story, this one from 1627 in Würzburg, Germany, during the height of the witch hunts. A baker named Clara Weiss was accused of poisoning bread with magic and tortured with the witch's chair, its spikes piercing her flesh as coals burned beneath. Trial records describe her screams, yet she denied the charges. The next morning, the chair was empty, its spikes bent, and a loaf of bread left untouched on the dungeon floor. Did her neighbors stage a rescue, fearing a cursed harvest? Or was her body removed to prevent martyrdom? Locals claimed the dungeon glowed at night, the scent of fresh bread lingering, a ghostly echo of Clara's trade. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how the dark psychology of fear and accusation fueled historical cruelty. Its stories woven into the dark history of medieval Europe. The role of gender in medieval cruelty added another layer to its dark psychology. Women, especially those outside societal norms, widows, midwives, or spinsters, were prime targets for accusations of witchcraft or heresy. The Malleus Maleficarum explicitly targeted women, claiming they were more susceptible to the devil's influence due to their supposed weakness. Tortures like the scold's bridle, used to silence gossiping women, or the witch's chair, amplified this gendered cruelty, humiliating victims in public. Yet women's defiance, like Agnes Sampson's initial resistance, challenged this narrative, inspiring sympathy or rebellion. This gendered dynamic, where women bore the brunt of historical cruelty, reveals the dark psychology of a patriarchal society, its impact a haunting chapter in the dark history of medieval torture. Let's dive into another tale, this one from 1500 in Venice, during the Inquisition's grip. A merchant named Luca Bellini was accused of blasphemy and tortured with the heretic's fork, its prongs piercing his chin and chest as he struggled to stay upright. Records note his refusal to confess, but his cell was empty, with the pearl left behind, gleaming in the dark. Was this a bribe by his wealthy family, or a divine omen? Locals claimed the dungeon hummed with whispers of Luca's prayers, a haunting echo of his defiance. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how the dark psychology of religious zeal fueled historical cruelty. Its stories a testament to resilience in the dark history of medieval Europe. The tools of medieval torture were physical extensions of this dark psychology. The rack, stretching limbs to extract confessions, amplified dread with each creak of its crank, as noted in John Fox's Book of Martyrs. The breaking wheel, shattering bones before crowds, turned pain into a public lesson, while the strappato's sudden drops broke spirits in dungeons. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, their small size belying their cruelty, and water torture suffocated without leaving marks. These devices, detailed in trial records from Spain to Scotland, were crafted for maximum pain, their use justified by the belief that suffering purged sin. Torturers, often outcasts, operated under this belief, their anonymity shielding them from vengeance. These tools were the machinery of historical cruelty, their pain a product of the dark psychology that drove medieval torture in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's explore another story, this one from 1615 in Fulda, Germany during the witch hunts. A teacher named Elizabeth Becker was accused of teaching children witchcraft and tortured with water torture, choking as water filled her lungs. Records note her silence on accomplices, but her cell was empty, with a child's slate inscribed with a cross left behind. Was this a rescue by her students, or a divine sign? Locals claimed the dungeon echoed with children's voices, a haunting reminder of Elizabeth's work. This mystery, tied to medieval torture, shows how the dark psychology of fear and accusation fueled historical cruelty. Its stories a poignant thread in the dark history of medieval Europe. The cultural impact of medieval cruelty shaped art, literature, and folklore, embedding its dark psychology in society's memory. Woodcuts depicted racked bodies or burning witches, their grim imagery a warning to the faithful. Ballads mourned victims, turning them into tragic heroes, as seen in songs about Joan of Arc or Agnes Sampson. Sermons used torture to preach against sin, while tales of haunted dungeons glowing with ghostly light or echoing with cries spread fear. The Decameron by Boccaccio captures crowds at executions, their emotions a mix of awe and dread, while later Gothic works like The Pit and The Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe drew on these images. This cultural legacy, driven by the dark psychology of fear and faith, underscores the enduring horror of historical cruelty in the dark history of medieval Europe. Let's reflect on the social and psychological reasons behind medieval cruelty. Fear of the unknown, the need for control, dehumanization, religious zeal, crowd psychology, and gendered persecution drove a world where pain was justice. Yet defiance victims resisting, communities rebelling reveals resilience amid horror. Medieval torture, a product of dark psychology, was a mirror of humanity's fears, desires, and contradictions. Its historical cruelty a haunting legacy in the dark history of medieval Europe. As we close, what does this dark psychology tell us about humanity? It reveals a time when fear shaped justice, yet courage shone through the shadows, with stories of defiance echoing across centuries. If this journey into medieval torture gripped you, Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and share your thoughts below. What's the most chilling tale of historical cruelty you've heard? Was this pain justice, or madness unleashed? Check our next video on witch trials where fear fueled torment. Stay curious, stay brave, and let the dark history of medieval cruelty haunt your dreams.